Have you ever felt the terrifying pull towards something that makes no logical sense? Something that whispers to you in quiet moments, promising not success or security, but a kind of aliveness that frightens you more than death itself. This is not about reckless abandon or naive romanticism. This is about the most dangerous thing you can do in a world built on conformity, following your bliss. And if you've ever felt that pull, if you've ever sensed that your soul is calling you towards something your mind cannot understand, then you are standing at the threshold of the greatest adventure known to humanity. Joseph Campbell spent his life studying the stories that shape us, and he discovered something profound. Every culture, every age, every human heart carries the same fundamental pattern: the hero who must leave the familiar world, face the unknown, and return transformed. But here's what most people miss about Campbell's work. This isn't just about mythical heroes or distant legends. This is about you. This is about the mechanical existence you've been living, the scripts you've been following, the roles you've been playing without ever asking who wrote them. Look around you right now. Notice how most people move through their days like sleepwalkers, following invisible tracks laid down by others, pursuing goals they never chose, living lives that feel like elaborate performances. They wake up to alarms, commute to jobs that drain their souls, spend evenings escaping from the very lives they've built. This is what Campbell would call the ordinary world. Not ordinary because it's simple, but ordinary because it's unconscious, mechanical, safe in its predictability. You've lived there too, we all have. That world where success is measured by external markers, where happiness is something you chase rather than something you are, where the deepest questions get buried under the noise of daily obligations. But something inside you has been stirring, hasn't it? Something that sees through the elaborate game everyone else seems to be playing with such deadly seriousness. This stirring, this restlessness, this sense that there must be more, Campbell would recognize this immediately. It's the call to adventure. Not the kind of adventure you see in movies, but the most radical adventure possible. The journey toward becoming who you actually are, beneath all the masks, all the shoulds, all the carefully constructed identities you've worn to fit into a world that was never designed for your unique essence. But here's where it gets dangerous. The moment you begin to listen to that call, the moment you start to question the scripts you've been handed, you begin to see how much of human life is built on collective agreements that have nothing to do with truth. You see that careers are often elaborate forms of hiding, that relationships can be negotiations rather than connections, that success might be the greatest failure of all if it takes you further from who you actually are. And when you see this, when the veil begins to lift, you realize you're no longer hypnotized by the same dreams that captivate everyone around you. You're awake in a world of sleepers, and that makes you dangerous, not to others, but to the very foundations of a society built on unconsciousness. You become a threat to the collective trance, and the trance fights back. This is why Campbell's hero always faces resistance, not just from external enemies, but from the very people who love them most, who want them to stay safe, to remain predictable, to not rock the boat of shared illusions. Your family might not understand why you're questioning everything. Your friends might think you're going through a phase. Your culture will offer you 1,000 distractions to pull you back into the mechanical dream. But once you've heard the call, once you've glimpsed the possibility of authentic existence, there's no going back to unconscious sleep. You stand at what Campbell called the threshold, that terrifying, exhilarating place where the familiar world ends and the unknown begins. You can see now that following your bliss isn't about chasing pleasure or avoiding difficulty. It's about choosing consciousness over comfort, truth over security, authenticity over acceptance. The path ahead is uncertain. It will ask everything of you. It will strip away the identities you thought defined you, challenge the beliefs you thought were unshakable, and lead you into territories your mind cannot map. But it's the only path that leads to life, real life, not the simulation of life that passes for existence in the ordinary world. When Campbell spoke of crossing the threshold, he understood something that most people never realize. The journey toward authenticity is, initially, a journey into profound solitude. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the sacred aloneness of someone who has stepped out of the collective dream and must now learn to navigate by inner stars rather than social maps. This is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of the heroic journey. Our culture equates solitude with failure, aloneness with something gone wrong. But Campbell knew better. He understood that consciousness itself is, at first, a solitary experience. When you begin to see through the masks everyone wears, when you recognize the mechanical nature of most human interactions, when you stop being satisfied by conversations that never touch the depths, you find yourself alone in a very particular way. You're alone not because you're broken or antisocial, but because you're undergoing what Campbell would call an initiation. Like the mythic heroes who must wander in the wilderness before they can return with wisdom, you must first learn to stand alone with your own truth before you can offer anything real to others. This solitude is not punishment, it's preparation. Think of it this way. If you're a musician learning to play by ear instead of following sheet music, you must first develop the ability to hear the subtle harmonies and discordant notes that others miss. This requires a kind of inner listening that's impossible when you're constantly tuned into the external noise of social expectations. The hero's journey always includes this phase of withdrawal, not from life, but from the unconscious participation in life's surface dramas. During this phase, you might find that small talk becomes almost unbearable, not because you think you're better than others, but because once you've tasted authentic communication, the kind that touches the soul and acknowledges the mystery of existence, everything else feels like eating cardboard. You might notice that many of the activities that used to satisfy you now feel hollow, like going through the motions of someone else's life. This is normal. This is necessary. Campbell would assure you that every hero faces this disorientation. You're learning to hear the rhythm of your own drum instead of marching to the beat of collective unconsciousness. And yes, at first it's a lonely sound, but listen more carefully. Beneath the surface noise of a world obsessed with external achievement and endless distraction, there's another sound, the sound of your own authentic nature calling you home to yourself. The beautiful thing about this stage of the journey is that you begin to discover resources within yourself that you never knew existed. When you can't rely on external validation to tell you who you are, when you can't lose yourself in the comfortable numbness of mindless consumption, when you're thrown back on your own inner landscape, you start to find treasures there. Creativity that had been buried under years of practical concerns, intuition that had been shouted down by rational analysis, a capacity for wonder that had been nearly smothered by cynicism. This is what Campbell meant when he spoke of supernatural aid, not literal magic, but the emergence of capacities that feel magical because they've been dormant for so long. You begin to trust your instincts in ways that seem almost supernatural to a mind trained to doubt everything but external authority. You start to recognize synchronicities, to sense the deeper patterns that connect things in ways that pure logic cannot explain. But here's the crucial point. This isn't about escaping from the world or declaring yourself superior to those still caught in mechanical existence. This is about developing the inner strength and clarity necessary to engage with the world from a place of authenticity rather than unconscious reaction. You're not becoming antisocial. You're becoming genuinely social, capable of real connection rather than just social performance. And if you've made it this far, if you recognize yourself in this description of the threshold crossing, then I want to invite you into something. Think of this not as watching a video, but as joining a conversation that's been going on for thousands of years, the conversation between those who have chosen consciousness over comfort, those who are willing to feel the initial loneliness of authenticity in service of something infinitely more meaningful than social approval. Subscribe not just to a channel, but to this ancient dialogue. Share in the comments not just your thoughts, but your own experience of hearing the call, of standing at the threshold, of choosing the hero's path even when, especially when, it leads away from everything familiar. You're not alone in this journey, even when it feels like you are. The path of following your bliss, as Campbell discovered, through thousands of myths and stories, inevitably leads you face to face with what he called the ordeal, the moment when everything you thought you knew about yourself gets tested by forces that seem designed to break you. This isn't a metaphor. This is the lived reality of anyone who chooses authenticity over social approval, consciousness over comfort, truth over the safety of shared illusions. Here's what happens when you start living from your bliss, rather than from external expectations. The world pushes back, hard, not necessarily with dramatic antagonists or clear villains, but with something more subtle and more powerful, the collective weight of a society that needs you to remain unconscious in order to function smoothly. Your awakening consciousness becomes a mirror that reflects back to others the compromises they've made, the dreams they've abandoned, the authentic self they've buried under layers of social conditioning. And they don't thank you for this mirror. Instead, they do what humans have always done when confronted with someone who refuses to play by the unspoken rules. They try to pull you back into the familiar trance. They question your sanity, your responsibility, your right to live differently. They offer you reasonable alternatives, practical solutions, safer paths that won't disturb the collective sleep. They love you, they say, and they're worried about you. And often, they genuinely are. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the hero's journey that Campbell identified, the realization that your liberation threatens those closest to you, not because they're evil, but because your freedom reminds them of their own captivity. Your courage to follow your bliss becomes a challenge to their choice to follow security. Your willingness to live with uncertainty becomes a judgment of their need for control. Your joy becomes a condemnation of their resignation. But here's where Campbell's understanding of the mythic structure becomes invaluable. He knew that this resistance isn't a sign that you're on the wrong path. It's confirmation that you're on exactly the right path. The hero always faces the greatest opposition just before the breakthrough. The darkness is always deepest just before the dawn. The forces that would keep you unconscious always marshal their strongest arguments when you're closest to real freedom. During this phase, you might find yourself doubting everything. Maybe they're right, you think. Maybe this whole idea of following your bliss is just selfishness dressed up in spiritual language. Maybe you should just go back to the safe, predictable life you were living before. Maybe being awake isn't worth the cost of being alone. This doubt, this temptation to return to unconsciousness, is what Campbell would recognize as the final test before transformation. But if you can stay with it, if you can continue to choose consciousness, even when it feels like choosing exile, something extraordinary begins to happen. You start to attract others who have made the same choice. Not the crowds who are drawn to easy answers and comfortable truths, but the rare individuals who have also chosen the difficult path of authenticity. And when you meet these fellow travelers, when you recognize the light of genuine consciousness in someone else's eyes, you discover a quality of connection that makes all the loneliness worthwhile. These connections aren't based on shared interests or convenient compatibility. They're based on shared commitment to truth, to growth, to the courage required to keep choosing consciousness over comfort. They're relationships forged not in the shallow waters of social convention, but in the depths of what Campbell called the hero's journey, the willingness to face the unknown for the sake of becoming who you really are. This is the treasure the hero finds in the darkest cave, the elixir that makes the entire journey worthwhile. The discovery that authentic connection is possible, but only between people who have first learned to be authentic with themselves. Love that isn't based on mutual unconsciousness, but on mutual commitment to consciousness. Relationships that support your growth rather than enabling your smallness. Community that celebrates your uniqueness rather than demanding your conformity. And to you who have recognized yourself in this description, who have felt the pull of your own bliss and the resistance of a world that prefers you unconscious, I want to say this: you're not crazy. You're not selfish. You're not alone. You're participating in the oldest story humanity knows, the story of the individual who chooses to wake up, to grow up, to show up as who they really are, regardless of the cost. Keep going. The world needs what you have to offer, needs it desperately, even if it doesn't know how to ask for it. Share your journey, not as someone who has arrived, but as someone who is still walking the path, still choosing consciousness, still following the bliss that calls you toward your own becoming. The return, in Campbell's understanding of the heroic journey, is perhaps the most challenging phase of all, because now you must find a way to live in both worlds simultaneously, the world of everyday responsibilities and social interactions, and the world of expanded consciousness and authentic being that you've discovered through following your bliss. You must become what Campbell called a master of two worlds, someone who can function in ordinary reality without losing touch with the extraordinary truth you've uncovered. This isn't about compartmentalizing your life, keeping your spiritual insights separate from your practical affairs. It's about integration, finding a way to let your awakened consciousness inform every aspect of your existence, from the most mundane daily tasks to the most profound life decisions. It's about learning to be fully present in the world of form while remaining rooted in the formless essence that you've discovered is your true nature. What this looks like in practice is both simpler and more complex than you might imagine. Simpler, because once you've truly connected with your bliss, with that deep knowing of what brings you alive, every decision becomes clearer. You have an internal compass that points toward what serves life and away from what diminishes it. You no longer need endless external validation or complicated decision-making processes. You know what resonates with your authentic nature and what doesn't. But it's also more complex because now you must navigate relationships and responsibilities with people who haven't made this journey, who are still operating from fear and scarcity and the desperate need to control outcomes. You must find ways to be genuine without being judgmental, to be clear about your boundaries without being defensive, to offer your gifts without forcing them on those who aren't ready to receive them. This is where Campbell's understanding of the hero's ultimate gift becomes crucial. The hero doesn't return from the journey to lord their wisdom over others or to withdraw into spiritual superiority. They return to serve, to offer what they've learned in ways that can be received and integrated by others who are still on their own journey toward consciousness. Sometimes this service looks like explicit teaching or mentoring, but more often it looks like simply living as an example of what's possible when someone chooses authenticity over approval, presence over performance, being over having. Your very existence becomes a kind of permission for others to consider that there might be another way to live, another way to be human that they haven't yet explored. The beautiful paradox of following your bliss is that the more authentic you become, the more genuinely useful you are to others. Not because you're trying to fix or save anyone, but because authentic being has a quality of aliveness that naturally draws people toward their own authenticity. Your freedom gives others permission to be free. Your joy reminds others that joy is possible. Your willingness to be vulnerable in service of truth creates spaces where others can risk their own vulnerability. But perhaps most importantly, your journey teaches you something that Campbell understood deeply, that the bliss you've been following isn't ultimately personal, it's universal. The consciousness you've awakened to isn't yours alone. It's the same consciousness that animates all life, the same creative force that moves the stars and grows the trees and beats your heart. Following your bliss isn't selfish. It's the most selfless thing you can do because it aligns you with the intelligence of life itself. This realization transforms everything. Work becomes play when you're aligned with the creative force of the universe. Relationships become celebrations of consciousness, recognizing itself in different forms. Even difficulties become opportunities for deeper surrender to what wants to emerge through you. You discover that following your bliss isn't about getting what you want. It's about wanting what life wants to express through you. And in the end, this is Campbell's great gift to us, the recognition that we are all heroes in our own epic story, all called to leave the familiar world of unconscious existence and journey toward the unknown territory of authentic being. The path is different for each of us, but the pattern is universal. Separation from the known, initiation into mystery, return with gifts for the world. So if you've felt the call, if you've heard the whisper of your own bliss calling you toward a life more aligned with who you really are, know that you're participating in the oldest, most sacred story humanity knows. Trust the process. Trust the journey. Trust that your authentic nature has something unique and necessary to offer to a world that desperately needs what you have to give. The universe is dreaming itself awake through you. Follow your bliss and let that awakening unfold.